Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for the warm welcome and the introduction. And I'd love to be with you in Hamburg. Unfortunately, I have a commitment later today in Freiburg, and given the current situation with the German railway system, it seemed very unwise to try to start the day in Hamburg and finish it off in Freiburg. So I apologize for being absent, but maybe for a conference in digital law, it makes kind of sense to use the possibilities of digital technologies also for presentations. Yes, and it was already mentioned that this idea to talk at a conference of young digital lawyers about a decidedly pre-digital topic, state secrets, kind of resonated with me, and I was very happy to accept this invitation. And we're going to explore this idea of state secrecy, or the concept of state secrecy in the next 30 minutes a bit. And I start this off with a quote from a TV classic. So even this goes back to the pre-internet era. My quotes here go back to the pre-internet era. I don't know whether you know it. If you don't know it, you should really check it out. It's the TV series is called the TV series here is called Yes Minister, and there is a fictitious permanent secretary in the English government, the British government, and the quote here is, open government is a contradiction in terms. You can be open or you can have government. This is, and it should also be a bit irritating, so it's always good to start off with a little bit of irritation. Isn't openness a value? I think that is something that we've learned, especially in German constitutional law, where the Federal Constitutional Court always says that executive decision-making must be, and I quote, visible and understandable. So openness, transparency as a value resonates with us. And here we see a different concept, openness and transparency as a type of order, or rather of disorder, that is something opposed to government. So maybe this is just a clever quip, but maybe there's more to it. Having said that, the idea to start off the conference in digital law with a talk on state secrecy resonated with me, because I think, or my observation is, that the discourse on digital law oftentimes suffers from a lack of history and context. And that is not particularly surprising, given the fact that the object of our study is digital technologies, as it is said, move fast and break things. And regulators who want to fix the broken things have to move incredibly fast as well. And think of the tsunami of new regulations coming from Brussels right now. So for legal academia, this is actually a huge intellectual challenge. It has become so extremely hard to keep track of the regulatory developments that oftentimes we lack the time for critical reflection and for historical contextualization. But I guess it's pretty obvious that most of the big ideas that structure digital regulation have in fact a history and also, of course, a context. So from time to time, I think it may be helpful to take a step back and reflect a bit on these concepts, on their origins, on the way they developed, and then maybe also on the way they need to be adapted in order to be applicable to the conditions of a digitized society. So let's do this for the theme of our conference, which is opacity and transparency in the context of digital law. Many papers, I've looked at the program, it's a great program, and many papers address pressing questions, the challenges AI and machine learning pose in terms of transparency, but also was already mentioned, the limits of transparency as a regulatory concept. I really like the title by Paul Nolan, Too Much Transparency is Not Always a Good Thing. And I guess if you look at the literature, the broader literature on transparency, you see that the critique of transparency is probably as old as the idea of transparency as a regulatory concept itself. And then more specifically, if you go to data protection law, and anyone I think who visited the website knows that the transparency concept of the GDPR, let's say, is improvable. And I guess tomorrow there's a talk on this too. Weniger ist mehr, very important topic. And it was mentioned, I myself have published a couple of papers on AI and transparency and explainability as well. But today, again, we are looking at this from a different angle. We're kind of turning the tables. And now going back to Humphrey Appleby, why should states keep secrets? Can we learn something about this idea, the concept of state secrecy, for our discussions on transparency? One important thing is already this, for states, it is extremely difficult actually to enforce secrecy. I go back to my first slide here. This is from World War II. I'm counting on you. In the discourse in law and technology, we typically think about how to make things more transparent, how to actually enforce transparency. For states, it's the other way around. It's how to stop the leaks. So I guess this, or I think, at least I hope so, that this turning the tables, looking at the phenomenon of transparency and opacity from a different angle may be interesting, or may hold some value for you. So my paper, I'll talk very little about technology. Instead, I focus really on constitutional history. So we take a quick dip into Renaissance political thought, and I want to show you here that the idea, the concept of state secrecy is actually very much connected to the idea of the modern state itself. In the second part of the paper, I switched to constitutional theory, and I try to explain why even in a constitutional democracy where executive government is visible and must be visible and understandable, there are legitimate grounds for secrecy. There is full transparency is not always a good thing there, we could say. So we'll look at these grounds on which secrecy may be justified. And third and finally, I then look at the regulatory framework by which states actually try to create secrecy. So let's start with the history. Many historians have actually observed that what I've just said, that the idea of secrecy was a key element in forming the modern state. And even before we enter the modern era, which I just, for reasons of simplicity, state that it starts around 1500, even in this pre-modern, in the medieval times, we find this idea of the mystery, the mysterium, and the mystery which was used to legitimize power. However, in the pre-modern era, this idea of mystery was very strongly connected to religion. And it kind of was temporarily and logically prior to what we could call medieval government. And we also have to acknowledge that the way in the Middle Ages government was formed was not identical with the state in our modern sense. Think of Georg Jelinek. So I'm leaving these pre-history of secrecy, of state secrecy aside, and start around 1500. Around 1500, secrecy starts to play an extremely important role in the theory of the state. So early political theorists developed a veritable cult of secrecy. They developed these so-called arcane politics, arcana imperii. And one of the writers you know who does this very prominently is Machiavelli. And not so well known, but probably equally important at this time was another writer, Giovanni Botero, who writes, and this is a quote, "Secrecy is of great importance because it not only makes the prince godlike." So we see here really the idea of the mystery, of the legitimizing mystery transferred from religion, Middle Ages, to the prince, to the modern state. So secrecy, legitimacy is now connected to the modern state. But because also it puts people in tense anticipation of so the ruler's, the prince's plans, because they do not know his thoughts. So there's this strategic element which we probably also associate with Machiavelli, but Botero has this as well. So these early modernist political theorists recognized that the decision on the design of government information flows has an eminently political dimension. Much later, we find this insight reflected in many pages of Max Weber's Sociology of Domination, his Herrschaftssoziologie. There, Weber goes on writing many pages how power is distributed between the state, both between the state and society, and then also within the state through the design of the informational architecture of the state. Secrecy creates superior knowledge, creates a competitive edge, you could say. Conversely, the duty to make things public, to make things transparent, weakens power. Then again, we find similar insights with many modern sociologists. I'm just mentioning Foucault's surveiller punir. There is no power relation without a corresponding field of knowledge being constituted, and no knowledge that does not simultaneously presuppose some kind of power relation. So I'm doing this here, the quotes from Weber and Foucault, not just to impress you with big names, but it's rather that I want to show you that this idea that the distribution of knowledge, information flows, is intimately connected to power is actually a very, very prominent idea since the 1500s, but then again 19th, 20th century thought on organizations, on society, etc. So there's really a big history and theory to this idea. Back to our early modernists, from their perspective, from Bottero's perspective, from Machiavelli's perspective, this is really kind of theorizing after the fact. They had already understood everything there is to understand, that knowledge is power, as Bacon has phrased it prominently, and that the rulers needed to create this arcane realm in order to legitimize their rule and to secure it. So here is the foundation of state secrecy as a political concept. From this perspective, the revolutionary step of enlightenment is actually not that fundamental, at least on a theoretical level. For the political philosophers of the Enlightenment era, Kant, etc., knowledge is power too. When they call them for transparency and when they denounce state secrecy, which they do in a discourse which you all know, Jürgen Habermas has called the structural transformation of the public sphere, they use actually the same logic and the same ideas as their absolutist predecessors. Liberals recognized that if they wanted to change the design or the nature of the state, they needed to change its structure of information flows, its informational architecture, and to replace the old, the arcane architecture with a new architecture, which they then called open or transparent. So in this 18th century, the concept of public opinion, which had been rarely used before, is really used as a counter concept to the self-legitimizing and power strategy of despotism, but in order to create a new regime of power, now a democratic regime of power. So the logic is identical, I think. Knowledge is power. The way knowledge is distributed really matters in political terms, only that the political concept now differs, and so the knowledge architecture needs to be changed. So against this background, if we accept this, the famous quote, which you find probably in every article on state secrecy, the quote by Hannah Arendt, "Real power begins where secrecy begins," is, I think, at least incomplete. It's rather, as the Enlightenment philosophers have recognized, that the call for transparency is also always a demand for political power and its redistribution. Transparency is not a neutral quantity, not a natural way information is distributed, but a distinct way of organizing things which may itself need to be justified. The most prominent critique of transparency we find in modernity in the context of these so-called auditing regimes, which are oftentimes used to create transparency. And it's pretty obvious that it's naive to neglect that these auditing regimes have power effects. So in a way, I guess Humphrey Appleby had a point when he emphasized that transparency, openness is a form of social order. So to sum this up, we can learn from history, if there's anything to learn from history, which is, of course, is always difficult, but let's assume that we can learn something here. We can learn that secrecy and transparency are actually not totally fundamentally different ideas. Rather, they are both ideas that are based on the insight that the flow of information and communication within and between organization matters for the political gestalt of the overall organization. So rules on transparency, but also rules on secrecy, must be understood as attempts to govern the internal and external flows of information, to stabilize or destabilize internal differentiations. So we can really understand these rules of secrecy with modern sociology as sociological forms for the regulation of the flow and distribution of information. So, from history to theory. I don't expect that you know this very cheap British movie thriller, State Secret. And this movie, a US doctor who has invented a new operation method travels from the United States to this fictitious Central European country, and there he wants to show to the local doctors his new operation technique. Of course, it's already a bit weird from start, but then he's doing his presentation, the presentation of his operation skills, and there's a mock patient, and suddenly during the operation, the oxygen mask of this mock patient slips, and the doctor, who's called Marlowe, then recognizes that this is actually not kind of a random person he is operating, but the autocratic ruler of Bosnia himself. So he has unwillingly discovered the ultimate state secret of Bosnia. The ruler is dying. The body of the ruler, of course, always the big theme of political theory, but also of Hollywood. Marlowe then must flee and lives through all kinds of adventures. So why I'm telling you this? We've just learned that secrecy and state secrecy is not a prerogative of autocratic government, but an inevitable feature of all kinds of organizations, all kinds of organized statehood, including constitutional democracies. But if we think of Pentagon Papers, WikiLeaks, the NSA, etc., we all know that even in constitutional democracies, there are spheres in which we feel that state officials are probably still a bit fond of this idea of the arcana imperii. Humphrey Appleby may be another example. So there are these big scandals, NSA, WikiLeaks, etc. But even if you look at our current administrative practice and the court practice, we find many cases which are really astonishing if we have in mind that actually our government is open and visible and understandable. So I mentioned just two of them, which I think are pretty interesting. A couple of years ago, researchers tried to get access to BND files on the Adolf Eichmann case. And I mean, that was back in the 1960s, so the administrative practice predating the abduction of Eichmann, etc., was the 1950s. So we could have really imagined that there had already been enough time passed so that this could be made public, but still the government refused access for reasons of the Staatswohl, and even prevailed in the Federal Administrative Court. Another example, which I find pretty astonishing, I don't know whether you know, we still know what is probably the biggest right-wing extremist terrorist attack in German history, the 1980 attack on the Oktoberfest. There too, researchers and journalists wanted to get access to some files because it's never been really cleared how the attack was carried out, and the agencies refused and also prevailed in courts. So there are still, let's say, problems with the idea of transparency in our current system. And nevertheless, it's true that in general, so on an abstract level, democracy is a government of visible power, as Norberto Bobbio has called it. Democracies have broken with the conviction that the arcane, the secret, has kind of this natural relationship to state powers. So in a democracy, we always need to justify the secrets. And we need to rationalize why we keep things secret. State secrecy shields no longer any higher truths. How can secrets be justified? They can be justified by using constitutional concepts such as democracy, separation of powers, fundamental rights, rule of law. But of course, the same concepts also may fight for transparency. So we really have to balance these aspects. So under which conditions, in an abstract way, can we say that state secrecy is justified? We could do several things here. We could look at the case law of the Federal Constitutional Court or the Federal Administrative Court. I've just mentioned 2 recent court cases. And we could also look at statutory law, statutory legislation. There's the Freedom of Information Act, and on the federal level and the state level. I'm not doing this. I'm rather trying to synthesize, to be a bit more abstract, skip the details and focus on what I think are the 3 main, you could say, ideal types of legitimizing reasons for state secrecy. So the first is strategic secrecy. I've said that secrecy can create information asymmetries, and information asymmetries enable strategic action. That is very important for private actors, of course, especially in markets. There is a lot of secrecy in markets in order to create information asymmetries, in order to enable strategic action. But it is also important, or can also be important, for state actors. The democratic state is, as Hermann Heller has called it, and I quote, organized decision-making and action unit. The state must effectively implement those goals that are assigned to it by its laws. This is true, for example, in the foreign policy context. We all know our current situation, international relations. Secrecy is important there, but it's also important within the polity. The state depends in some instances on information advantages over its legal subjects. For example, fight against crime, here wiretapping, but also enforcement of tax, competition law, financial regulation, etc. This is an important and traditional part of why we can legitimize state secrecy. Of course, that is only so the strategic secrecy is always a temporal secrecy. As soon as the situation kind of is over, we cannot use strategic reasons in order to justify secrecy anymore. So if the German government still wants to exclude access to the Adolf Eichmann files, it cannot justify it with strategic reasons. All other perpetrators have already died. So there is no reason to keep these things secret for strategic values. So there is this temporal dimension to strategic secrecy, and then there's, of course, also always a balancing test which we need to do. There are conflicting information interests, and it's only legitimate as long as no countervailing interest in transparency prevails. The second dimension is actually a bit more interesting than the strategic dimension, which I think is pretty obvious. This is, the picture is the room where the judges of the Federal Constitutional Court deliberate. They deliberate, as you know, in secrecy. This is quite typical for courts. They deliberate in secrecy. Most courts do that. And if information gets leaked from courts, which is very rarely the case, but it was, for example, in the Dobbs case, this has caused major turmoil. It's not universal. There are courts which deliberate in public. In Brazil, for example, the highest judges deliberate not only in public, they even have their own TV court system which broadcasts the deliberation. But of course, that does not mean that there is less secrecy in Brazil. It probably just moves to another venue. So why do courts deliberate in secrecy? There are different facets to this question. In general, sociologists and psychologists tell us that sharing a secret connects people. In organizations, sociologists tell us that secrecy sharing is actually not a stop for communication, but a generator of communication. So this fact of shared secrecy is something which is very important. We should always keep in mind that secrecy is actually communication between persons, and this communication may become intimate by the very fact that it is a secret. So institutional secrecy differs from strategic operational secrecy, that it's not related to a specific situation in which the state must have this competitive edge. It is rather connected to this institution, the existence of a constitution. So I think there are 3 sub-cases in which we can say institutional secrets are legitimate. First, within an institutional setting, court, for example, or an administration. Secrecy enables organizational units to form a communicative identity and to stabilize their organizational differentiation against the environment. Conversely, transparency obligation relativizes the informational autonomy of an organization and thus impair social cohesion. Where strong social cohesion already exists, new transparency obligation can have undesirable side effects of increasing decentralization. Can also create the effect which Matthias Gierstedt has described. The open word is only spoken behind closed doors. So if we make, when you're transparent, if we make an organization transparent, then the secret deliberation, as I've said for the highest federal court of Brazil, just moves to another chamber. So there may actually be a good reason to keep institutional secrecy safe and to safeguard, in order to safeguard institutional differentiation and formal organizational structures. In German constitutional law, we find this idea very prominently in the context of the separation of power structure. So separation of power structure means in informational terms that each power enjoys some kind of Kernbereichschutz. So the protected core, which remains invisible to the other powers in order to safeguard their communicative identity. In government bodies which decide by majority, there is another reason why we need institutional secrecy, because it helps to facilitate decision-making. This is because majority decision-making is regularly based on compromises and also usually or typically a long game. So you give me that now and I give you that later. So compromises require a tactical approach, both within the group, but also in dealings with the public. Full transparency can increase the political costs for such compromises and thus make decision-making more difficult. And in a constitutional system such as the German, which is based very much on this, on the concept of compromise, this is actually a very important aspect. So facilitating internal decision-making. The third aspect is probably the most speculative. Institutional secrecy, I think, becomes also relevant where decision makers enjoy a high level of actual discretion, but the decision must be sold to the public as compelling, as a decision without discretion. I'm thinking here again of courts. We as lawyers all know that courts enjoy a considerable margin of discretion in many cases. Still, the idea and the justification for having courts is still that they kind of can find the law. So there is this disconnect between what courts actually do and the way they are perceived, not only by the public, but also in the constitutional system. So here, institutional secrecy can serve as, you can say, a lubricant to support the acceptance of decisions which are quite free, but which must be sold as compelling. And thus it can generate systemic trust. We should be very careful with this argument, and I'm open to objections on your part if you don't find this convincing. Institutional secrecy is something which we actually have in courts, and in Germany it's paragraph 43, sections 43 of the Deutsche Richtergesetz, a German act on the judiciary. And there is this very strong protection for the core deliberations of the court. And that applies even if there is only a single judge and there is no majority decision making, even if there is not really the core of the power of the judiciary concerned. And this protection, I think this protection in sections 43 of the German Federal Judiciary Act is really supporting the acceptance of judicial decisions and generating systemic trust. It is justifiable only in a constitutional democracy, I think, if other parts of the decision-making systems are then in a compensatory way very, very transparent. And we have this again, in the context of the judiciary, the trial and the deliberations of the court with the parties, of course, are extremely open. The public is admitted. So there is really this kind of balance struck again. So institutional secrecy, I think, particularly interesting field, why we justify secrets. Oh yeah, that was the court in Brazil. So the last justification for secrecy is again much easier to understand. It's what I call fiduciary secrets. We all share with each other information which we do not want to disclose to third parties, and this also happens to the state. Voluntarily, if I submit an application, if I communicate with the state and submit information which must not be made public to third parties, and involuntarily, if the state uses its powers to gather information about me, wiretapping, for example, like most extreme case. In all cases, the state then becomes the trustee of secrets and thus becomes responsible for protecting the integrity and confidentiality of the data. Of course, there also needs to be a balance needs to be struck between this kind of fiduciary secrecy and conflicting transparency interests. What is interesting is that in German statutory law, Section 6 of the German Freedom of Information Act, how this balance must be struck is almost entirely left to the courts. And the courts need to evaluate, of course, the value of the transparency vis-a-vis the value of the transparency interest, vis-a-vis the value of the interest in secrecy, and but they also need to consider in which way information can be made transparent so that it does not infringe too much upon the privacy interests or commercial interests of the person whose information is made public. So the courts here do not only have to balance values, they also need to have an understanding of how transparency or secrecy can actually be implemented. And this brings me to the third part of my presentation, constitutional practice or administrative practice. I will be much quicker here. How is secrecy regulation actually structured? So again, we think about turning the tables. Typically, we think in the law and tech discourse, how is transparency going to be implemented? How can we make transparency regulation for the state? It's the other way around. How can we keep information secret? And I start again with Humphrey Appleby. The Quib Official Secrets Act is not to protect secrets, it's to protect officials. And again, there is some truth to it. So this, yes, Minister series is really, they're really clever writers. Why is there truth to it? Law cannot change the world. Law cannot change technology. We know that. The only thing law can really do is to attribute responsibility for someone, to someone for something, or to release someone from responsibility. So in this sense, legal regulation on state secrecy is not, of course not, able to keep information secret by itself. Rather, in order to be effective, these rules require practical infrastructure and institutional embedding, and first and foremost, also people who live by those rules. So one could again say a lot about the details of this, of the way state secrecy regulation is done in Germany. And I'll not do this. I'll just very quickly show you which dimensions this regulation of state secrecy needs to cover. So starting on the left side, the protection of state secrets needs procedural, organizational, and technical infrastructures which must be created and operationalized by legal regulation. In Germany, the equivalent to the State Secrets Act, the most prominent law on secrecy is the Sicherheitsüberprüfungsgesetz, the Security Clearance Act. This act is a risk-based regulation which contains precise instructions on what constitutes a secret in abstract terms, who may handle this secret in personal terms and in technical terms. And instead of going into the details of this law, I'm just mentioning that this law is actually extremely important, not only for creating secrecy, it is for creating secrecy, but it's also a very important transparency tool. Why is this the case? by defining the criteria for the steps in which secrets can be classified and these personal and technical surroundings, Parliament has actually limited which types of information can be classified as a secret, and it has introduced organizational and procedural requirements for keeping things secret. So this actually prevents, or it should prevent, of course there's abuse, I'm not denying this, but still, in general, it is creating, or it's preventing that there are information black holes within the administration, information which is fully exempt from any kind of control. Rather, this Security Clearance Act makes it necessary for every information which the administration wants to classify as a secret, to justify this. So there is a justification for secret. They need to share the secret then also with those institutions within the own organization, or even with third parties, so supervisory institutions, in order to justify this. So the formalization of state secrecy contributes not only to secrecy, but also paradoxically to transparency. The second dimension. A secret is not a secret if nobody gets to know about it. Secrets are, we've learned this, something which is not outside of communication, but a privileged channel of communication, a relationship between persons, a communicated relationship between parties which excludes third parties. So laws on secrecy, laws on state secrecy, do not simply ban the disclosure of information. We find these bans in criminal law, but in administrative law, they are complemented by laws which regulate explicitly or implicitly who can be part of the communicative relationship which is constituting the secret. Legal academia has so far paid comparatively little attention to this institutional dimension of secrecy, but it's actually very important. And we think of transparency and secrecy oftentimes in terms of whether the public has access to information. But in fact, within the state, there are many ways in which a secret can and must be shared with other state institutions, which then can take off legitimacy and accountability concerns. So I'm thinking of independent authorities which are supervising state secrecy, external experts who get access to certain secret information, parliamentary subcommittees, judges, specialized institutions, which we find in the context of intelligence law, the G10-Kommission, etc. So there is actually, even for secret information, there is always a huge body of government authorities which actually has access to this information. So this, defining these criteria for role-based access, offers indirect protection against overclassification. It increases the probability that information will reach the public, whether by accident or by negligence or by deliberate disclosure, because all major leaks in the past are actually have been caused by the fact that in a complex bureaucracy, information flows can never be completely controlled. So this is an important factor. The other two dimensions are really very, very quick. Of course, defining the substantive scope of information access right is important in regulating state secrecy. Think of statistical information which is made available, which does not give away strategic secrets, but nevertheless informs the public. And then I've mentioned this already, temporal differentiations in the law of secrecy. And there we can also think of the way of combining role-based access criteria with these temporal dimensions, so parliamentary control immediately, public control later, and there are many ways in which we can actually build on these building blocks an adequate concept of access to information and also of protecting secrets. So I'm coming to an end now. One last thing. In ancient Greek, these persona masks, as they are called, they were used in theater, and they were used during the Dionysian mysteries. These Dionysian mysteries were ritual where, as Wikipedia writes, intoxicants and trance-inducing techniques like dance music were used to remove inhibitions and social constraints, liberating the individual to return to a natural state. So here at this very beginning of our culture, we already see this idea that secrecy and liberation, freedom is actually something which is connected, which is not totally disjuncted. I certainly do not want to draw parallels between the Dionysian mysteries and academic events. That may be the case, but the important message of my presentations is that secrets, even state secrets, serve important social functions. And instead now of telling you what all of this means for law and technology, digital law, I leave this to our discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.